When ambitious journalist Maxwell Reed arrived at the White House press briefing, he believed his carefully crafted questions would finally expose the administration's weaknesses and boost his career to new heights. He had no idea Karoline Leavitt was about to deliver the most devastating professional takedown in modern press conference history. But before we dive into what happened next, let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and if you've ever witnessed a moment when truth triumphed over media manipulation. The James S. Brady press briefing room buzzed with anticipation that morning. Journalists from every major network and publication had gathered, their laptops open and cameras ready. The tension in the air was palpable. This was the first press conference following the administration's controversial economic policy announcement, and everyone wanted answers. Maxwell Reed sat in the third row, his designer suit and perfectly styled hair, marking him as one of the rising stars of global news network. At just 32, he had already made a name for himself with his aggressive questioning style and dramatic gotcha moments that regularly went viral. His Twitter bio proudly proclaimed him as speaking truth to power, though many had begun to question whose truth he was actually speaking. "Ladies and gentlemen, White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt," announced the staff member at exactly 10:30 a.m. Karoline Leavitt strode confidently to the podium, her navy blue blazer and crisp white blouse projecting both professionalism and authority. At 27, she was one of the youngest press secretaries in American history, but her poised demeanor and razor-sharp intellect had quickly earned her the respect of even her harshest critics. "Good morning, everyone," she began, her voice clear and commanding. "Before taking your questions, I'd like to provide some context on yesterday's economic policy announcement and clarify a few points that seem to have been misrepresented in certain outlets." In the third row, Maxwell shifted in his seat, a slight smirk playing on his lips as he reviewed his prepared questions. His producer had been clear this morning. "We need a viral moment, Max. Something that'll drive traffic all weekend." He tapped his pen impatiently as Karoline methodically outlined the administration's position. "The proposed economic framework is designed to address three critical challenges," Leavitt explained, her voice steady and measured. "First, strengthening American manufacturing. Second, reducing inflationary pressures on working families. And third, creating sustainable job growth in emerging industries." As she spoke, Leavitt maintained eye contact with different journalists around the room, her confidence unwavering. Several reporters nodded thoughtfully, taking notes on the nuanced policy explanation she provided. "With that context established," Leavitt concluded her opening remarks, "I'm happy to take your questions." I believe Janet had her hand up first. Janet Chen from the Associated Press asked a straightforward question about implementation timelines, which Leavitt answered with specific details and data points. The next few questions followed a similar pattern. Professional inquiries met with substantive, fact-based responses. Then Leavitt's gaze fell on Maxwell Reed, whose hand had been raised insistently for several minutes, his expression growing increasingly impatient. "Yes, Maxwell," she acknowledged, her tone remaining professional despite the subtle shift in the room's atmosphere. Everyone knew Reed's reputation for creating confrontational moments designed more for social media clips than substantive journalism. Maxwell stood, adjusting his tie slightly for the cameras he knew would now be focused on him. "Thank you, Ms. Leavitt," he began, his voice carrying a hint of condescension that didn't match his smile. "I have a multi-part question about yesterday's announcement." Without waiting for her acknowledgement, he continued, "Given that three prominent economists have already labeled this plan as catastrophically misguided and built on magical thinking, can you explain why the American people should trust an administration that continues to push policies that experts universally condemn? And as a follow-up, how do you respond to reports that this plan was rushed through specifically to distract from the president's plummeting approval ratings?" A tense silence fell over the room. Several journalists exchanged uncomfortable glances, aware that Reed had grossly mischaracterized both the expert response and made a completely unsubstantiated claim about the administration's motives. Karoline Leavitt didn't flinch. She stood perfectly still at the podium, her expression calm as she held Maxwell's gaze for a moment that seemed to stretch forever. When she finally spoke, her voice remained measured, but carried an undercurrent of steel that commanded attention. "Thank you for those questions, Maxwell. I'd like to address them one by one, she began, her tone professional despite the provocative nature of his inquiry. First, your characterization that economists have universally condemned this policy is demonstrably false. She reached for a folder on her podium and opened it without breaking eye contact with Reed. In fact, I have statements here from 17 respected economists, including 2 Nobel laureates, who have specifically endorsed key elements of this framework. I'm happy to read their assessments verbatim if you like. Maxwell's confident smirk flickered slightly, but he maintained his challenging stance. Those are obviously cherry-picked opinions that— I wasn't finished answering your multi-part question, Mr. Reed, Leavitt interrupted, her voice firm but not raised. You asked why the American people should trust this plan, and I'm providing that context. The room grew quieter, journalists leaning forward in their seats. This wasn't the typical press secretary flustered deflection they were accustomed to seeing when faced with aggressive questioning. Something different was happening. As for your second question implying this policy was created as a distraction, Leavitt continued, I have to wonder if you were present at any of the 6 public economic forums held over the past 3 months where these very proposals were discussed and refined with input from industry leaders, labor representatives, and yes, economists from across the political spectrum. She paused, letting her words sink in. These policy proposals have been developed methodically over many months with extensive public input. To suggest otherwise isn't just inaccurate, it's a disservice to the thousands of Americans who participated in that process. Maxwell's expression hardened. This wasn't going according to his plan. He had expected Leavitt to become defensive, to fumble through a non-answer that he could later clip and post with a provocative caption. Instead, she was systematically dismantling his premise with specific facts. Well, the timing certainly seems convenient, he pressed, raising his voice slightly, and you haven't addressed the criticism that this plan privileges certain voting demographics while ignoring— I'm going to stop you there, Maxwell, Leavitt interjected, her tone shifting subtly. You've now introduced a third allegation that wasn't in your original question, and it's yet another claim without factual basis. The room grew tense as other journalists watched the exchange unfold. Some were already typing furiously, sensing that this confrontation was veering into unprecedented territory. Perhaps, Leavitt continued, her voice now carrying a hint of concern, we should examine what's happening in this exchange, as it illustrates a troubling pattern in how information is sometimes presented to the American people. She set her notes down and looked directly at Maxwell. You began by claiming universal condemnation from experts, a statement I've demonstrated is categorically false. You then suggested, without evidence, that complex policy was formulated as a political distraction. Now you're pivoting to a third unsubstantiated allegation. Maxwell shifted uncomfortably, glancing briefly at his fellow journalists. I'm simply asking questions that the American people want answered, he countered, falling back on the familiar defense. Are you, Leavitt asked, her question hanging in the air, or are you making statements disguised as questions? There's a critical difference. A murmur rippled through the press corps. This level of direct confrontation between a press secretary and a journalist was unusual, and everyone in the room could sense they were witnessing something significant. The role of the press is essential to democracy, Leavitt continued, her tone sincere rather than condescending. When journalists ask tough, fact-based questions, they serve the public interest. But when they insert false premises and unsubstantiated accusations into those questions, they undermine that very role. Maxwell's face flushed slightly as he realized the exchange was not playing out as he had anticipated. Are you suggesting I'm not doing my job properly? He demanded, indignation rising in his voice. I'm suggesting, Leavitt replied calmly, that there's a difference between holding power accountable and manufacturing conflict for engagement metrics. Your questions today, and frankly, your pattern over recent months, seem to prioritize the latter. The room fell completely silent. Other journalists looked at each other, many unable to hide their surprise at Leavitt's direct challenge to one of their colleagues. Maxwell quickly tried to regain control of the narrative. That's a blatant attempt to intimidate the press, he declared, his voice rising. Typical of this administration to attack journalists who ask difficult questions instead of providing actual answers. Karoline Leavitt took a deep breath, and when she spoke again, her voice was quieter. forcing everyone to listen more carefully. I've provided specific, factual responses to your questions, Maxwell. What I'm declining to do is accept the false premises they're built upon. That's not attacking the press. It's respecting the truth and respecting the American people's intelligence. She glanced around the room, making eye contact with several other journalists. Everyone here asks difficult questions. That's your job. But most do so without embedding false statements or motives into those questions. Maxwell remained standing, his expression hardening. So you're saying some journalists are acceptable to this administration and others aren't? That sounds dangerously close to determining who gets press access based on whether they're friendly to your messaging. Leavitt's expression showed genuine concern now. That's not at all what I said, and it's troubling that you would characterize it that way. Let me be absolutely clear. All journalists, regardless of their outlet or perspective, are welcome in this room and deserve respectful, honest answers. She placed both hands on the podium, leaning forward slightly. What I'm addressing is methodology, not access. When you present false information as established fact within your questions, you're not seeking truth. You're creating confusion. The tension in the room was palpable now. Other reporters were watching with rapt attention, some nodding subtly in agreement with Leavitt's assessment. Perhaps, Leavitt suggested, her tone constructive rather than confrontational, if you'd like to rephrase your question without the embedded false premises, I'd be happy to address your substantive concerns about the economic policy. Maxwell's expression shifted from indignation to barely contained fury. He sensed control of the situation slipping away. Worse, he recognized that many of his colleagues were not rallying to his defense as he had expected. I don't need to rephrase anything, he snapped. The American people can see through this administration's attempts to control the narrative by attacking journalists who dare to question its policies. Leavitt nodded thoughtfully. That's an interesting perspective, Maxwell. But let's examine what's actually happened in this exchange. She held up one finger. I provided specific facts contradicting your characterization of expert opinion. A second finger went up. I explained the transparent, months-long process behind these policies that contradicts your distraction theory. She continued, her voice steady and clear. At no point did I refuse to answer questions about the policy itself. What I've challenged is the practice of embedding false statements within questions, a practice that doesn't serve the public's right to accurate information. Maxwell remained standing, but his confident posture had visibly deflated. You're twisting my word, he insisted, though with less conviction than before. I've quoted your words directly, Leavitt countered gently, and I've responded to them directly. What I won't do is tacitly accept false premises by treating them as valid starting points for discussion. She looked around the room, addressing the entire press corps now. I respect the essential role that all of you play in our democracy. Tough questions, critical perspectives, holding us accountable. These things strengthen our system. But democracy is also undermined when misinformation is introduced into public discourse, regardless of the source. Several journalists nodded in agreement, some even murmuring their assent. Maxwell glanced around, suddenly aware that the room's sympathy had shifted away from him. So you won't answer my question, Maxwell declared, attempting one last time to frame the exchange as administration evasion rather than his own questionable tactics. On the contrary, Leavitt responded, her voice carrying both firmness and patience. I'm very eager to answer substantive questions about this economic policy. That's why I'm here. If you'd like to ask about specific elements of the plan without embedding false premises, I'd be happy to provide a detailed response. Maxwell remained silent for a moment, clearly calculating his next move. The dynamic had shifted, and he knew it. What he had planned as his viral gotcha moment had instead become a masterclass in how skilled communication could disarm manipulation tactics. I think your refusal to engage speaks for itself, he finally said. His voice clipped as he sat down. I don't believe that accurately represents what just happened, Maxwell, Leavitt responded, her tone almost sympathetic. But I appreciate your questions and remain available to discuss the actual policy details whenever you're interested in those. She then looked up, scanning the room. Let's move on. Andrea, I believe you had a question? Andrea Peterson from the National Times stood. Yes, thank you. Regarding the manufacturing incentives in the new proposal, can you elaborate on how they'll be targeted to ensure benefits reach small and medium businesses, not just large corporations? Leavitt nodded appreciatively at the substantive question. Excellent question, Andrea. The framework includes 3 specific provisions designed to address exactly that concern. As Leavitt provided a detailed answer filled with specific data points and implementation strategies, Maxwell Reed sat silently fuming. He pulled out his phone, already composing an angry tweet about administration hostility toward the press, but paused as he noticed something unexpected. Several of his colleagues were posting praise for Leavitt's handling of the briefing. The press conference continued for another 40 minutes, with Leavitt answering questions with remarkable specificity and transparency. The atmosphere in the room had shifted noticeably. Journalists were asking more substantive policy questions and receiving informative answers in return. Even reporters typically critical of the administration were engaged in constructive exchanges about legitimate points of disagreement. Maxwell remained silent for the remainder of the briefing, his expression darkening as he watched what should have been his moment of triumph transform into a professional embarrassment. When Leavitt finally concluded the session, thanking everyone for their thoughtful questions, Maxwell quickly gathered his things and headed for the exit. Maxwell, do you have a minute? He turned to find Andrea Peterson beside him, her expression unreadable. What? He snapped, not bothering to hide his irritation. That was rough in there, Andrea said quietly, keeping her voice low so others wouldn't overhear. But maybe worth reflecting on, Maxwell scoffed. Reflecting on what? That this administration attacks any journalist who dares to ask tough questions? Andrea raised an eyebrow. Is that really what happened? Because from where I was sitting, she answered plenty of tough questions today. From me, from Chris, from Sanjay. The difference, Maxwell interrupted bitterly, is that some of us are willing to call out this administration's propaganda while others just stenograph it. Andrea shook her head. No, Max. The difference is that some of us ask questions to get answers, while others ask questions designed to create viral clips regardless of accuracy. Maxwell stared at her in disbelief. So you're taking her side? After all that talk about press solidarity? This isn't about sides, Andrea replied firmly. It's about credibility. When you embed false premises in questions, you make it easier for them to dismiss legitimate criticism. You're actually undermining the rest of us. Without waiting for his response, she turned and walked away, leaving Maxwell standing alone as other journalists filed past him, many actively avoiding his gaze. Outside the White House, Maxwell found himself bombarded with notifications. To his horror, clips of his exchange with Leavitt were already circulating widely, but not in the way he had envisioned. The prevailing commentary wasn't about administrative evasion or hostility toward the press. It was about journalistic integrity and the difference between accountability and antagonism. His editor's name flashed on his phone. Taking a deep breath, Maxwell answered, already dreading the conversation to come. Max, his editor began without preamble, we need to talk about what happened in there. Ellen, I can explain, Maxwell started, but she cut him off. I've just watched the entire exchange. 3 times, actually. Her voice was tightly controlled. This isn't what we discussed this morning. She twisted everything around, Maxwell protested, made it about my questioning style instead of addressing the substance. Max, Ellen interrupted sharply. I've been in this business for 27 years. What I saw wasn't a press secretary dodging questions. It was a press secretary refusing to accept false premises while remaining willing to answer the actual substance. Maxwell fell silent, stunned by the lack of support from his own editor. The fact checks are already rolling in, Max. On your claim about universal condemnation from economists, not only not universal, the majority of publicly expressed expert opinion has been cautiously positive. That's not, Maxwell began, but Ellen continued relentlessly. Your claim about this being rushed through as a distraction? The public record clearly shows these proposals have been developed over months with extensive public input. We have literally covered those forms. Maxwell swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry. Here's what's going to happen, Ellen continued, her voice now dangerously calm. You're going to take 2 weeks off. Paid leave. When you come back, you'll be working with our fact-checking desk for a month before returning to the White House rotation. You're pulling me from the White House? Maxwell couldn't believe what he was hearing. Because I asked tough questions? No, Max, Ellen replied tiredly. Because you asked questions containing demonstrably false information, and when called on it, you doubled down instead of correcting course. That damages our credibility as an organization. The call ended, leaving Maxwell standing alone on the White House lawn, his carefully constructed professional image crumbling around him. As he slowly walked toward the street, his phone continued to buzz with notifications. Colleagues, friends, and total strangers all commenting on his public misstep. 3 weeks later, a much more subdued Maxwell Reed sat in his apartment, scrolling through job listings. His leave had quietly transformed into a mutual separation from Global News Network. The viral clip of his exchange with Karoline Leavitt had become a case study in journalism schools, though not in the way he would have hoped. His phone pinged with a message from a former colleague. "Have you seen this?" The link led to a press release announcing that Andrea Peterson had been promoted to White House correspondent at the National Times. The accompanying photo showed her asking a question at a briefing, with Karoline Leavitt at the podium, engaged in what appeared to be a tough but respectful exchange. Maxwell closed the browser with a sigh. The past weeks had given him plenty of time to reflect on what had happened. Initially, he had clung to his narrative of being victimized for asking hard questions. But as the days passed and he reviewed the footage repeatedly, an uncomfortable truth had begun to emerge. His questions hadn't been designed to elicit information. They had been crafted to create moments. Moments that would go viral, generate traffic, boost his profile. Somewhere along the way, he had stopped functioning as a journalist seeking truth and had transformed into a content creator seeking engagement. His phone rang, displaying an unfamiliar number. Hesitantly, he answered. "Maxwell Reed?" a woman's voice asked. "Yes, this is he replied cautiously. "This is Patricia Winters from the Columbia Journalism Review. We're putting together a piece on the evolving relationship between the press and administration communications. Given your recent experience, we thought you might have a unique perspective to share." Maxwell was silent for a moment, weighing his options. He could double down on his victimhood narrative, or he could do something more difficult, and ultimately more valuable. "I do have a perspective," he said finally, "but probably not the one you're expecting." 2 months later, Maxwell's byline appeared in the Columbia Journalism Review under the headline, "When I Stopped Being a Journalist," a personal reflection on accountability and truth. The thoughtful, self-critical piece examined how performance incentives, social media metrics, and personal ambition had gradually corrupted his fundamental journalistic mission. The article went viral, ironically giving him the widest audience he'd ever had, and sparked intense discussion throughout the media world about the line between accountability journalism and performance. It also caught the attention of a smaller, respected news outlet that valued his newfound commitment to reflection and integrity. 6 months after the infamous press conference, Maxwell found himself back in the James S. Brady press briefing room, sitting in the back row with his new press credentials. As Karoline Leavitt entered and took her position at the podium, their eyes briefly met. To his surprise, she gave him a small, professional nod of acknowledgement before beginning the briefing. The gesture wasn't warm or friendly, but it contained something more important: respect. Professional respect between a press secretary and a journalist, both committed, despite their different roles, to serving the public with accurate information. When the briefing concluded, Maxwell approached the podium as the room cleared out. Leavitt looked up from gathering her notes, her expression neutral but not hostile. "Ms. Leavitt," he began, suddenly finding it difficult to say the words he had rehearsed. "I just wanted to say, that day changed the trajectory of my career. At the time, I was furious. But with some distance and reflection, I realize now that you did something important." Karoline regarded him thoughtfully. "And what was that, Mr. Reed?" "You maintained a standard," he replied simply. "When faced with questions built on false premises, you neither accepted the premises nor attacked the questioner's right to be there. You just held the line on reality." A small, almost imperceptible smile crossed her face. "That's the job, isn't it? Not just mine, Yours too. Maxwell nodded. It should be. I lost sight of that somewhere along the way. Well, Leavitt said, gathering her folders, your recent work suggests you found your way back to it. That Columbia piece was illuminating. Thank you, Maxwell said, genuinely appreciative of the acknowledgement. I'm trying to do better. Leavitt nodded. That's all any of us can do. She paused, then added, I'll see you at tomorrow's briefing? Yes, Maxwell confirmed. I'll be here, with real questions, looking for real answers. I look forward to it, Leavitt replied, and for the first time, her smile reached her eyes. As Maxwell left the White House that afternoon, he reflected on how a moment of professional humiliation had ultimately led to personal growth. The path from performative antagonism to genuine accountability hadn't been easy, but it had led him back to the fundamental purpose of journalism, serving the public by pursuing truth, not clicks. The viral moment that had nearly ended his career had, in the end, saved it, not by making him famous, but by making him better. And in a media landscape increasingly dominated by performance over substance, that was a lesson worth sharing. Meanwhile, in a small coffee shop 2 blocks from the White House, Karoline Leavitt sat across from her communications director, reviewing the day's briefing. That was quite a moment with Reed, the director commented, stirring her coffee. Didn't expect to see him back in the briefing room after what happened. Leavitt considered this. People can change. His recent work shows he's actually grappling with the tension between journalism as public service and journalism as performance art. Think it'll last? The director asked skeptically. I don't know, Leavitt admitted, but I do know that when we respond to performative antagonism with substantive defense of truth, we win regardless of what any individual journalist does next. She closed her briefing folder and looked out the window at the White House in the distance. Our job isn't to make them like us or to avoid tough questions. It's to ensure that when Americans hear exchanges in that briefing room, they're getting accurate information, even if that sometimes means correcting the premise of the question. Well, the communications director said with a slight smile, that exchange 6 months ago certainly did more than just correct a premise. It changed the entire dynamic in the room. Leavitt nodded thoughtfully. Because it wasn't personal, it was about process and standards. And deep down, most journalists actually care about those things, even if incentive structures sometimes push them in different directions. The communications director laughed softly. You know, when we hired you, some people wondered if you were too young for this role. I think you've thoroughly answered that question. Karoline smiled. Age has never been the relevant metric. Preparation, precision, and respect for the truth. Those are what matter in that room, whether you're the one asking questions or the one answering them. As they gathered their things to leave, the communications director's phone chimed with a notification. Would you look at that, she said, showing Leavitt the screen. Reed's piece in the Columbia Journalism Review just won the Ethics in Media Award. Good for him, Leavitt said sincerely. Maybe some good came out of that confrontation after all. More than that, the director replied. Journalism schools are now using the video of your exchange as a teaching tool about integrity and questioning. You didn't just win a moment, Karoline. You helped change the conversation about what accountability journalism should actually look like. Leavitt shook her head modestly. I was just doing my job. Sometimes, the director said as they stepped out into the Washington afternoon, doing your job well can have ripple effects far beyond what you imagine. As they walked back toward the White House, neither woman noticed the young journalism student sitting at a nearby table, who had overheard their entire conversation. The student looked down at the notes she had been taking for her ethics class assignment, suddenly understanding that the most important lessons about journalism weren't found in viral gotcha moments, but in the patient, persistent defense of accuracy and truth, regardless of which side of the podium you stood on. And if you found this story illuminating, make sure to like and subscribe for more honest examinations of media, politics, and the search for truth in our complex world. We believe that integrity matters, that facts are non-negotiable, and that civil discourse can help heal our divided nation. Thanks for watching, and remember, in a world where performance often overshadows substance, the quiet commitment to truth still matters most.